Uh-oh. Over the years, I never really understood the fascination, and I've finally been convinced. So in particular, the idea of randomizing and putting stuff on every slide is something that I am very fond of. So I'm going to be talking today about just some stuff, really. I'll flip the order of the talk around so that we can just cover the boring stuff quickly. Like I said, so the unicode-math package is something which has been a little bit slow to come together over the years, and so I wanted to focus on some of its development aspects rather than too much of the programming, too much of the actual feature side of things. And then fontspec is something which has developed over a long period of time, and I wanted to focus a little bit on its interface because it's not something that I've talked about for a long time, and probably people may not have seen some of its newer aspects. So before I go into it, I want to bring up a couple more pictures. This is being recorded. I don't know about copyright and stuff. Let's just assume this is all okay.
Fair use.
Exactly. And it's only a snippet of the page, if that makes a difference. So I've been reading books to my son recently and learned something new about fonts, which is that fonts in kids' books are really... so fonts in kids' books are kind of weird. So this is a relatively okay example here. I don't know if anything jumps out at you as being a bit weird or strange about this this snippet. Do you notice anything? So this A kind of looks a bit weird. It's got this little funny foot on it, kind of like it's an upside down letter that's been adjusted a little bit. And the Y and the G, I should have brought up an example of what a real font is supposed to look like. They kind of look a bit strange. I don't know if this is because people think that children don't understand letters, and so they just want to put up a simplified version of the letter, which I guess is fine, but sometimes they do it in a really ugly way. So my favorite font, or one of my favorite fonts, I should say, is by Herman Zapp, Palatino. I know it gets used a lot, but sometimes for good reason. It's quite distinctive, and I noticed something that rather upset me in this book. Where are we? I don't know how I don't know what they've done. This letter A, I find just really offensive. It doesn't really show up very well on these slides, but the weight of that letter is not the same as the rest of the letters, and yeah, whatever has gone wrong here, it's not very nice. And you can also see something similar with that G. Sorry, make that a little bit higher. So this is just to sort of set the scene in that to kind of reiterate something that has been said a lot over the years, is that once you start noticing fonts, it really decreases the quality of your life because you notice all of the bad ones. Okay. So a lot of people have been putting up emails to indicate how things started. I didn't quite remember what got me into all of this mess, and it was back in 2004. I don't actually understand how I've gotten to be so old, where I just sort of posted some code up in a mailing list, and obviously I'm now here 15 years later with, I don't know, however many hundreds of hours that have been invested into this this great community that we're all part of. So back in the old days, fontspec was not called fontspec, it was called typespec. And then I realized there was something with the same name on C10, so that changed. Oh. Okay, so as the overview, like I said, I'll focus first on Unicode-math, just talk a little bit about its development, and then go into fontspec. Now, but before I talk about the development of Unicode-math, for people that haven't seen it, I just want to do a really quick demo just to show what it is. The idea behind Unicode-math is to use a Unicode font for mathematics, and There's a long sort of backstory about why that's a really good thing. Because it uses a Unicode mathematical font, it's only for the Unicode engine, so ZTech or LuaTech. Now, if we aren't using Unicode Math, we should be able to run this, and we get some maths. That looks good. By the way, this equation comes from my day job. If you are very good at solving this equation, then please come and work with me. I need some help. So when you load Unicode Math, basically nothing, in theory, nothing much should change. Sorry, my laptop is a bit old on battery. You can see some spacing changed, and that is due to either bugs in the engine. It's not usually Unicode Math's fault, because all Unicode Math tries to do is swap some symbols around. Sometimes it is my fault, though. Largely, things should just work. As I spoke about a couple years ago, I have introduced some new commands now. So you can see here I'm using mathbf to display these symbols, because that's what LaTeX would use. In theory, in a Unicode context, that's no longer really correct. And symbf would be the right way to do it. Recompiling this, however, we should see kind of little difference. Now, that's all good and well. Something that doesn't get enough attention is that you can use these Unicode Math symbols, so this is kind of copying and pasting from the PDF into the source. Let's see if it actually works. Ta-da! So actually, to be honest, I find that a little bit ugly in the source. I do often prefer to use semantic markup in my mathematics when I'm typesetting it, largely because it simplifies things, but also because it means that I can change the symbols that I'm using without having to do search and replace inside of maths equations and so on. But I do think that this
proves the point.
Well, sometimes it is good. Like putting in Greek letters, for example, is something that I think will become more and more common. Programs like Python and also Mathematica, for example, allow you to use Greek symbols in your variable names and so on. And personally, I find that kind of nice to look at. When you're dealing with vectors in mathematics and so on, it is also, if you're not going to change your symbol around, like B is the magnetic field, well, I guess you should call it the flux density. And that's never going to change, so I don't really need to encode that in a macro. So if I were to write, let's forget how to write it. We can just copy and paste, and then in it goes. Then finally, one of the things that I like about this package is that it normalizes away changes that you might see in the input. So Unicode Mathematics provides both upright bold mathematical symbols and italic bold mathematical symbols. And if you're just sort of pasting things around willy-nilly, it's probably unlikely that you want to use both of these at the same time. Now, Unicode Math allows you to specify whether you want upright or italic on a case-by-case basis. But you can also change things altogether, all at once. So if we say math style equals ISO and recompile, apparently ISO standards would prefer italic bold. There we go. So aside from changing fonts, Unicode Math is intended to be, in my opinion, a relatively good interface into writing the mathematics. Of course, it doesn't provide any structure like AMS Math does.
This one is configurable? ISO?
Not internally, but if there are different styles that people want, I'm happy to kind of add them if it makes sense. All right. So LaTeX was my introduction to software engineering, which is kind of scary. What are people laughing at? To echo something that Joseph was talking about, when I first wrote fontspec in Unicode Math, they were before the Example3 programming language was being used, really. And I was spending all of my time writing poorly a variety of programming structures and algorithms and data structures in regular LaTeX. It was pretty fun to go back to the 1980s tugboat articles and be like, oh, this is a better way of doing iteration. But I was never going to be as good as someone like Joseph, for example, at writing these things. Now, over time, I got a bit more busy than when I was just doing my PhD and sort of not minding how long my PhD ended up taking. So making code nice often takes second place to actually just getting it working in the first place. So it's only relatively recently that it's all been properly tidied up. And probably not, it's probably not 100% perfect from that perspective. So I'm saying that this is to learn from my mistakes, but it's not really that interesting to talk about, oh, okay, this is how my code is structured and this is how you should do it. So I'll skip over this as quickly as I can. I already did the live demo. I guess this is a little bit out of order. So a long time ago, I wrote some examples of how to use docstrip in a kind of insane way where you can put everything into the DTX file. You don't even need a .ins file. This means to distribute the package, you just send people one DTX file. And again, as Joseph remarked, over time you end up with like a 20,000 line long package that becomes kind of awkward to develop. And once I started actually splitting it up into lots of different little files, my life became a lot better, really. So now I provide the DTX file, which is basically empty of anything except a little bit of metadata. So I list all of the DTX files which will be used. This gets reused a number of times to typeset the code documentation, to extract the code from those files, and then I feel like there's a third one. And scrolling down, we just see, okay, this is the title of the package, this is who I am. Again, that gets reused a couple times, which is why it's sitting in here. And then the package loading itself, which is simply just at this point, hello, I'm unicode-math. Now load the rest of me. So following some nice file conventions allows L3 build, again, thank you to Joseph, to do all of this in a relatively sensible way. And there's really no downside to providing lots of little files now, because it's not that common to distribute LaTeX code by email these days. I mean, obviously you can do it, but GitHub now exists, and it's very easy to just provide links to a repository. So having everything in a nice, properly structured repository is far better from the software development perspective than everything all in one big monolithic impossible file. I also have separated out the documentation so that I'm just writing a regular old LaTeX file to write about the user interface. And again, this is something which wasn't how you used to do things, and it caused a few awkward moments because you're writing everything in comments, and then if you're not using a very good editor, then it doesn't do the code highlighting properly. And I even came across a bug once where it messed up something to do with an if conditional nesting problem, but let's forget about that. All right, so lots of different types of files, and it's all kept nicely together by the fact that L3 build allows you to say what files are supposed to do what. If we take a look into the side here, you can see that there's a fair amount of stuff there, and there's also test files, of course, which I'll talk about shortly. Now, I use a change file now to put all of the changes that have happened in the package. This used to sort of be part of the README, and it was getting really, really long. I then realized that when this is in a separate file, you can actually extract data from it automatically and use that as the actual ground truth for this stuff. So rather than setting the package version in a number of different places, L3 build now can extract what the version number is supposed to be from this file, and it can put the date in there as well. The number of times that I've released a package and it's had the wrong date, or I've forgotten to increment and a version number somewhere, was kind of getting a bit embarrassing in the end. I received a lot of criticism, probably implicit over the years, that my code did not really follow all of the standards that the LaTeX 3 team would suggest that people use. And this was partly because it predated those suggestions, but also because, like I said, things got kind of busy. I've now gone through and fixed up basically all sorts of things like indentation, which we didn't have a consistent way of doing that early on, and you know, code, how many spaces you indent your curly braces is obviously a very controversial area of the computer science literature. Bruno has provided all of these really great code checking tools. So although it's slow to do this in a production document, for all of the test files, we can now load code which allows the Expl 3 code to check whether you're using variables correctly, whether you're using functions which have now been deprecated, and so on. So that's really nice. I'm not sure if I should actually say this publicly, but for a long time I was using Git in basically the dumbest way possible, of just having a single branch and everything was just being smashed together. And this made it difficult when I released a package and then 6 months later I'd not got around to releasing a new version of it, had made some changes here and there, and then someone was like, oh, there's a really important bug fix that you need to do now. They're like, oh, damn it, that means I have to actually finish all of this code that has been sitting half done on my machine and then finally get the release out. So this happened once or twice when some sort of serious bug came up that would actually literally break the package, and I then had to dedicate like a whole day to figuring out how to then perform my release. Thank you, Joseph, for the help with some of these problems. But I now use Git in the second most dumb way of doing everything in 2 branches. So the master branch now is only containing code which is pushed to CTAN, and it means that when bugs do come up, or when people are making pull requests, which is happening more and more frequently now that GitHub makes that easy, I can accept them straight away and know that it's all kind of working. Then everything in my actual working branch, I consider that people shouldn't be looking at that, so I do things that you're not supposed to do, like rewriting the Git history and so on. That works much more nicely in terms of knowing that I can break things, and I've still got the stable version sitting publicly for people to use. The test suite is something which I did want to talk in a little bit more detail about because I find it kind of interesting. Paolo Ney was talking about the fact that he was doing image-based diffs for a lot of his work, and that was originally how my test suites for fontspec and unicode-math worked. These were basically essential for the early iteration of the unicode-math package, because all of this stuff involving source and normalizing Unicode and figuring out the switches so that sometimes you'd have bold or italic or not. This was all very fragile and subject to that part of the code was being changed a lot. The way that I did that was to make the PDF and then convert that to PNG and then do an image-based diff with this terrible, terrible makefile that once I would get working, I would not understand how it worked, but it would work for like 6 months and then something would not work in it, and I'd have to spend a whole lot of time then trying to figure out what didn't work about it. The problem with it all, like if that was the only problem, that'd be okay, but I would get all of these false positives because I don't know if it was an anti-aliasing thing where occasionally a bit of a pixel would change, and that would say that the test has now broken, but actually it was just that there was this very minor thing that wasn't my fault. Nonetheless, I produced a lot of tests in that time. And eventually I just stopped running them because they were too slow and they started breaking too much. The other problem with image-based diffs and looking at code that works with fonts is that sometimes fonts change too. So I'd get a new version of font and then all my tests would break. Now, L3 build came along and changed a lot of this. It codified how LaTeX 2e was historically running its tests for many, many years. And this was great because it meant that I could do my tests in a more supported environment. Now, at the start, I just put logging output. Is that actually the right? Is that really a command? I wrote that off the top of my head and forgot to check it. Anyway, this writes everything that goes on the page in its internal box format into the log file. And while this is better for doing diffs against, you still get all of this mess in there, which actually isn't important for your test, like how much glue is between a box and spacing on the page and stuff like that. So it's not really fine. I, again, was finding that there'd be false positives and so on coming up. And of course, when you are spitting out the contents of boxes willy-nilly into the log file, it's really hard to actually see what is supposed to be the important part in there. So I've been slowly rewriting all of my tests to only show up very, very minimal aspects into the log file. And mostly that's been okay. As an example, they look like this. I have my own sort of customized preamble so that I can, if I want to, write like every single italic mathematical character into a log just to check that they're all making sense. I've also got a few macros in there which simplify my life. So test box doesn't just log the box, but it puts inside a box of 0 width and height and so on to minimize the amount of stuff that gets spat out. So this is the result of this test, where you can see the box has no information associated with it, because again, that's an area which occasionally I'd get rounding error changes happening in there, and it would show that tests would be failing when they shouldn't be. The input here is just x equals x, basically, with a different font. So what I'm looking at here is that the correct fonts are being used. And then also, ZTech gives you the glyph number, which allows you to check that, yes, it is an x from this particular font. If the font changes, that'll change. But again, sometimes you have to live with some of this. There is a bit in there that I wish that I could get rid of more easily, like the glue and the kerns. But
why don't you just use a grep on the output from tracing output?
could,
and then you just get the lines as glyph and nothing else.
partially because I'm lazy and building more tools is a little bit of work, but also because this is good for testing like programmatic stuff as well. So everything is in the same sort of testing ecosystem. So my tests, I've only got about 50 tests in both of these two packages, and I really need a lot more of them. But it's the sort of thing which I'm sure a lot of you would know. It's not always the most pressing need to write a test which is currently passing, just in case it breaks in the future. So speaking of improving my development approach, I still have this really, really long checklist, which I tend not to follow when I'm doing a new release, which involves running the test suite on my machine, running the test suite on the server. Travis does that automatically for me, but making sure that that all works in different contexts, like when you're using an unmodified version of TeX Live versus the current up-to-date code of the team and other things that I'm working on. But largely speaking, this is something that I'm trying to automate more and more, so that if I ever do have to give these packages away, there's a documented way that this is all happening. So now to the fun stuff. So what we would like to do really is, Joseph and I have been discussing that the way that we're developing these relatively large packages is something that we'd like people to emulate. So if we can figure out how we think the best way of doing this is, we can document it and ask people to follow the same conventions. If we do that, it then allows us also to build better tools for following these and to do more automated checking that stuff is how it should look. Okay, so with the font spec stuff, this is changing pace. I want to talk more just about how people select fonts, how people use fonts, and give some little examples and stuff. So font spec started out, like I said, before I knew how to do software development and before I knew how to design an interface and things like this. So it started out with just a single command, /fontspec, and that selected a font. People suggested straight away, oh, hang on a minute, it'd be really nice if you could set the default font with this code. And so things started happening from there. Originally, because ZTeX was developed on what was then Mac OS X, which did not have OpenType support, it used its own font technology known as AAT, and this is actually a very different model from the OpenType font model. So FontSpec's original interface was designed around the fact that you would load font features by key val and so on. Now, that is basically gone. I think that there is residual AAT technology in macOS, but I would be surprised if it's there for much longer. But ZTeX now also supports the graphite font renderer, which, if you haven't heard of it, is it's a technology that allows people to come up with fonts that might support languages that aren't in Unicode yet, and supports technologies in terms of how you shape all of the characters that needs to be programmed within the font itself. So it's more powerful and flexible than OpenType itself, which makes it interesting, but it's got relatively niche use cases. Now, because ZTeX has then had this, because FontSpec has had this sort of meandering history, it means that some of the stuff in there is based on old decisions that we could probably reconsider. And something that Frank is hassling me about is, well, actually, how about we design this thing from scratch and see what that would look like so that we've got something that we can rely on for the next, I don't know, how long has LaTeX 2E been around? 25 years? The next 25 years, let's say. So to load a font in FontSpec, there are a number of different types of commands. Like I mentioned, /fontspec, which just loads the font straight away. That's of limited use in a regular document. Set main font sets the main font. And then there's also set sans font and set mono font, just to match up with LaTeX traditional font interfaces. You can then define your own font families with new font family. And there's a new way of loading fonts around the idea of this thing called default font features. And so I'll give an example of how that works. But this does mean that there are lots of different ways of loading fonts, and really is one of them better than the other? There is scope to sort of reconsider how this works. Now, jumping right into some of the specifics, ZTeX originally was designed to use Mac OS X's font technology APIs essentially to load its fonts. So people got used, or people had to in the beginning, write things like set main font Hoffler text, where Hoffler text is a font distributed inside of Mac OS X, or now Mac OS. And one of the nice things about FontSpec was that it automated the lookup of what's the bold font, what's the italic font. Let's just do everything that we can to make life easy for the user. Now, LuaTeX obviously came along, and although it didn't use the same interfaces at all, Lua OTF load was adapted and released, which emulated this behavior. So it has a tool which scans through standard font directories and constructs its own metadata, or basically a database of fonts that it knows about and the relationships, and tries to guess which font should be bold, which one should be italic, and so on. So at the moment, you can write these commands and things kind of just work for the user. But what doesn't really just work is that looking up these bold and italic fonts is a bit of a heuristic thing, and sometimes ZTech and Lua OTF load will do different things. So someone asked me at this conference, oh, I had to change the name of the font to make it work in one engine versus the other. And I'm like, yeah, that's just because who knows why. It's not fontspec's fault. But it means that things are a bit fragile. And it also means if you want to move from one PC to another PC, then you have to replicate your font installation, which to me is a bit of a hassle. So you can also load fonts by file name, and I think this is far more portable and reliable. So I should probably rewrite the documentation a little bit to really more strongly emphasize this way of doing it. People just run into problems less often. The main problem with loading fonts by file name is that you have to specify all of them. And I no longer really think this is so much of a hassle, partially because of some of the newer font spec features, and partially because there's so much variation in fonts nowadays that you probably do actually want to specify them explicitly. So this is kind of one way of setting the main font, where you put the name of the font in as the first argument, and then you say what's the italic font, what's the bold font, and so on. There's also a couple of shorthands to make your life easier, so you can use a star and then sort of copy that information through. And the fact that you're specifying an extension there means that fontspec knows to load this by file name. Now, this is great, but it is still something that people get annoyed at typing out or copying and pasting between all of their documents. So, I should quickly demonstrate the other way of doing this. So this is jumping the gun because I'll talk about this shortly, but you can also write a .fontspec file, which is a terrible kind of extension because it's more than 3 characters long. On the other hand, it's pretty unambiguous what it is, and all of the operating systems now can have arbitrary extensions. So if you put all of this stuff into a file, this is Gil sans Nova, fontspec knows to load this file and basically execute all of this stuff. So it means that, let's say you buy a fancy font, you can write these files to load things quite explicitly, and you never have to repeat all of this crap to actually use that font. Like I said, I'll go back over that shortly. So I already basically talked about this. Font names are fragile. There are edge cases. Document portability is a bit more tricky. And then also speed can be a problem. If ZTech or Lua OTF load have to find a new font and or have to do something with the database, then there can be a bit of a delay while that happens. In fact, while I was here, I had a problem with Lua OTF load in that I had to regenerate my font database for an unknown reason. Before I did that, the documents wouldn't even compile. So if everything was by file name, this wouldn't be a problem. Now, I also want to touch briefly on choosing font features, and this is something which is now tied mostly to OpenType, but originally this interface in fontspec was designed to be agnostic as to which font technology you were using. So whether it was a graphite font or an AAT font or an OpenType font, you could use the same user interface to get the same features where they overlapped. So this is the plain equivalent of the plain tech way of loading fonts, where you put the file name in, and then you can see this is EB Garamond with, down the bottom, lining numbers and discretionary ligatures. I am sure that you can see which discretionary ligature is being activated here. And it's something that this capital TH ligature is something that I've seen some really strong opinions against. I don't think it looks that bad personally, but I've seen comments where people think this is just a disaster, and you should never use this ligature in your writing. I don't know if let's just continue that discussion in a less formal environment. I'd be interested to hear your opinions. So, asking the user to remember that LNum means lining numbers and that dlig means discretionary ligatures, I don't think is very friendly. So in fontspec, you use a key-val interface, so numbers equals lining, ligatures equals discretionary. And whether this is the best way to do it is sort of probably up for debate, but sort of works for the time being. Oh, I should also say, loading numbers like this, font features like this in general, is something which it kind of cascades in the same way of like a CSS kind of context. So if you are loading a font from disk, for example, and you want to add these numbers, these features early on, you don't have to specify all of the features in advance in that .fontspec file I was showing you. So as a typical example, I showed you on disk this Gil Sans Nova font, which I have. I should unsubscribe from the mailing list that sends you the like, not this week only, 90% off this really expensive font. Like, oh, 90% off? I can't not buy it. So the fonts that I'm demonstrating here, I should emphasize I've purchased these. So Gil Sans Nova, it comes in, what's that, 9 different weights, which is pretty great. This goes back to our previous talk about the fact that meta font type ideas are now allowing font designers to be quite creative in what they offer to their customers. It also is good for the font designers because they can charge 9 times more than if there was just one of these weights. So it's kind of good for everybody. One thing that I would like feedback on is whether people would like more features in fontspec to control this sort of stuff. So whether like a text bolder and a text lighter command is actually something that would be practically useful.
Yes.
Oh.
Yeah, for context-dependent emphasis, when I want to have emphatic text, and I want something inside to make it even more emphatic, I don't want to change my programming if I change the underline.
I'm going to show you exactly that in a second. So it's good to hear that we're thinking along the same lines. Now, the weight is not only the only thing that can be controlled. So these are the condensed styles of Gil Sans Nova. And again, the same question comes about whether it would make sense to have commands which allow you to select between them. You can even imagine a 2D grid. Oh, just for weight, you can, like weight and condensedness.
My question is the name. Eat less, eat more.
Oh, well,
Control weight.
Exactly. You can have like 2-dimensional grids of the amount of expansion on a font, like this is a condensed, but you can have expanded as well, and then in all of the different weights. Why I haven't done that is because you would have a sparse kind of a grid, and so if people ask for an expanded light font and you don't have it, what do? I guess you look at that grid and see what's being asked for and find the closest font in that grid, but...
Ultra bold.
Yeah, so who knows? Of course, you have other way, designers can be infinitely creative. And so no matter what kind of standardized interface I put into fontspec, I'm never going to add, what have we got here? Font deco, just because Gil Sans happens to open what it calls a deco style, which is kind of cute. I like it. Not the sort of thing that I can use very often in my day job when I'm, writing engineering articles, but I can be a bit creative when I'm giving lectures to students. So, yeah, these, there's I have no complaints about these, but just that this is the sort of thing which means that we can never have a standardized interface to fonts entirely. We do need it to be a bit extensible and so on. So most of the time in a document, I'm just after like a regular and a bold. So the default way of doing that, like I showed, is to create this fontspec file and you can load it. Now, this means in the document I just write, set main font, Gill sans Nova, and I guess there's a bit of a question here about whether you should actually be using the font name or whether maybe I should call it the not even talking about the name of the font, but I could call this presentation font, and then I would just be saying set main font presentation. And so where I've kind of drawn the line there is that when I'm creating font spec files, I do use the name of the font in one way or another. But then the font spec command new font family allows you to be semantic about it. So here I'm saying new font family caption font Gill sans, which I think makes sense from the user interface perspective. Over time, and this was actually a suggestion by Ulrike originally because she had some interesting use cases for using LaTeX NFSS a little bit more heavily. FontSpec can allow you to, it's a layer over LaTeX general font interface, and that's very flexible. So if you need to load all of these different weights and so on, FontSpec now allows you to do that. And so it doesn't matter what the tags are here in the beginning, but this is, have I even got this the right way around? Yeah, series and shape. So all of these different weights would go under different series tags. So UU, LL, HH, and XX don't mean anything, but as long as I know what I'm doing in my document, then that's okay. You could actually even write light, heavy, extra bold in there if you wanted to. There doesn't have to be a 2-letter or a so on tag.
But we need FD file, right, for this?
Say again, sorry?
You need FD files then to define this.
No, this, so basically what FontSpec does is write an FD file dynamically. It doesn't actually write it to disk, but it constructs it exactly as you would have to. So, Boris had this great, I've got a comment from Frank.
I have a question to the previous one where you talked about the semantic layer of having caption font or something.
Sure.
I was just wondering, seeing that, is it always the case that you have a single? I mean, if you go semantically, then something like fonts for captions or fonts for floats tend to give me the idea that there could be more than one family involved, and I'm not quite sure you're supporting that. Do you? I mean, just thinking about if you make this layer of abstraction, whether it's really correct to have that layer tied to a single family.
So let's say if you're talking about having like captions, there should be a default family that is used by the captions of the document, for example.
There could be more than one. That's what I'm saying. I mean, if you have captions and the captions contains typewriter stuff, then you may not have the typewriter coming from Gill sans whatever.
Okay,
deco,
I see what you mean.
Where the rest is actually Gill sans deco font.
Right. So that's a very good point and a good reason to rethink these interfaces. That if you change the context of the document, you might want to redo sans Roman and code.
I'm just wondering when I saw this whether this is the right level of extra.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good comment and probably something that we can work on extending. Okay, so we had a suggestion earlier that this sort of changing the weights in a context-dependent way is an important thing to be able to do. So LaTeX 2E supports something it calls M-inner shape. So if you define the right meaning for this command, it allows you to nest emphasis within emphasis and get something sensible. So by default, LaTeX, if you nest emphasis, it will just go italic, Roman, italic, Roman, italic, Roman, which is okay. But some people will say, well, if you're emphasizing something in italic text, how about that goes to small caps? So this allows you to do that to one level of nesting. FontSpec now allows you to do arbitrary levels of nesting. So if this isn't something that has really been that well described or discussed with people, so I'll be interested to hear if you find this sort of thing useful. Here we're saying if you go inside emphasis, first go to it shape, then if you go inside emphasis inside of that, go to upright small caps, then if you go inside emphasis inside of that, go to italics again. And this, they all are applied on top of each other, which is why that final it shape looks like it is just a repeat of the first one. So you get something like this. RM goes to italics AAA, and then that goes to small caps BBB, and then that goes to italic small caps III. That's A, B, it doesn't go C because italic C is a bit hard to differentiate visually in this context. And pretty recently I thought, well, hang on a minute, HTML has a strong tag. LaTeX only has emphasis. Why don't I add strong to LaTeX? So we can now do this in exactly the same way that the emphasis works. So you can have levels of strongness, or strength, I suppose you would call it. So here we go, nesting strong inside of itself. And I think that's relatively logical. What this doesn't allow you to do is go the opposite way. So if you're inside of strong and you want to go weaker, oh, no. That doesn't exist. I thought I had a comment about that. And again, that's sort of the kind of question that I think we do need to consider a bit seriously. You can kind of come up with arbitrary ways of controlling what happens here, but from a document perspective and from like an authoring perspective, it's not clear exactly what the best ways of doing some of these things are.
Usually, books about typesetting say that in fine typesetting, bold fonts and strong is not should not be overused and better not to use at all. So I would I would not encourage
right.
the document author and style writer to go into this.
Yes, I completely agree. Even in mathematics, sometimes you see vectors being typeset with arrows.
Yeah.
And I think the reason for that is so that you maintain a grayer page, or besides just being a stylistic preference. Yeah, you don't want to give the user. Sure. But you know these features do get used in all sorts of different situations, and so if you're using these commands to make a poster, then yeah, you want to provide the user useful enough tools that they can use the power of without sort of giving them too much rope to hang themselves.
Okay.
All right. The final thing I wanted to talk about in terms of features here is that due to some work with David, our friend who couldn't make it this meeting, we now have a more consistent way of doing the encoding between ZTeX and LuaTeX. And when I say encoding, I mean this from a LaTeX to E perspective. And this has opened the door to allow custom encodings within fontspec. Now, it's pretty logical at this point to ask, well, hang on a minute, everything is Unicode, so why do you need more than one encoding? Well, fonts are not always perfect. And so an example that I didn't exactly stumble upon, because I don't do multilingual typesetting myself, but an idea here might be that you're typesetting Sanskrit, which has an under dot accent. And Sanskrit in particular, in my extensive perusal of yoga books, there's some really, really terrible typesetting out there with trying to get this into things like the Kindle readers. They just do the worst things possible when they're doing typesetting Sanskrit. So you might have a book about yoga where you need to put some Sanskrit words in there, and you choose a font which supports that, and it all works. But maybe in the section headings of your book, your publisher has chosen an attractive-looking font that has been designed nicely, but it hasn't been designed nicely to contain all of the accents that it should. And so here's an example. Charasil is a really nice font designed for multilingual typesetting that's produced by Sil. And here's an example that works as it should because it has the underdot accent. You just choose the font. Now, I've forgotten what Kalitam means. I hope it's not rude.
I think it's something like a purse, I would think so.
Okay, so, that's innocuous enough for me. So this is great. This works. But if you load a font which doesn't have this, so Posterama is a nice font designed for doing posters and things, you just get the accent on the side there in a bit of a strange way. That's because it doesn't have the right font information to combine those characters like they're supposed to. And so you could say, well, hang on a minute. Old-fashioned tech knows how to do this dot thing. You just put a full stop there and move it around. So if you load a new encoding which does that for you, it works again. So this is not in any way accessible, or you can't copy-paste this and have things work, but it looks right, and that's one of the important use cases. Importantly as well, you don't have to do anything extra in your markup. So as long as you're using /d to make this dot appear, then it works fine. If you actually have the Unicode symbol there for the underdot, we can't intercept that, and you get the wrong output again. At the moment, things might change. So this is what it looks like. fontspec provides a few wrapper commands just to make this slightly more convenient. So you define your new name for your encoding. You can load in the default, which is TU, and then you can just redefine what you need or add what you need. I don't see this being hugely useful for everybody, but I think every now and again it's going to pop up where it does solve someone's problem. So just to emphasize, this poster font comes with all of these neat variations. So this is the 1901 style, the 1913. So that the years are supposed to represent to, I don't know, cultural periods in some way. 1919, 27. And 2001 to reference the film. All right. So because I am the last speaker, I've taken it upon myself to not really wrap up my talk in any way besides to say thank you a lot to everybody. So in terms of the development side of things, I really need to thank so many people that have been involved in making this ecosystem functional and to provide the engines and provide the macro levels and everything. So there's too many to even try listing everybody, but I wanted in particular to thank Joseph, who's sitting here in front of us, or in front of me. He's in.
Okay.
Joseph has provided such a driving force behind the LaTeX 3 project, keeping us organized and actually shipping code, which is the really important thing. So I don't think that we could be here really with all of this great LaTeX 3 code without his contribution. So thanks, Joseph. I also want to thank all of my users for their patience when I don't release new versions of my code very often. I read this great piece of advice that you should never say sorry, you should say thanks. Like, sorry for my slow email. You should say thanks for your patience on my slow email. Things don't move along as quickly as they do now that I've got work and family influences on my life. And finally, Paolo Ney and Paolo C. Thank you for your contributions to make this conference happen. It's been a really fantastic conference. I'm sure everyone here would agree. It's been a bit of a long trip for some of us, but for some of us, it's always a long trip. So I'm really happy to be back in Brazil and to make a lot of new friends. And thanks to everyone for making this conference such a success. All right.
Questions? somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but you didn't mention where this list is that tells us where we can get these amazingly cheap fonts, but have they got you on commission?
No, I only talk about the fonts because I love them. It's literally just a linotype mailing list, and if you buy one font, then you'll be on it. So it's dangerous.
Not a question, just would like to say it was a privilege to have each and one of you here and enjoy of your presence and of your permanent and hard work. Thank you.
Mm.
Thanks everybody for coming. It's really great to have the opportunity to bring this meeting to Brazil. And we should proceed to go take a photo group, which is a tradition among TAG meetings. There is a special place here on the third floor, isn't it? And which is a little bit more lighted.
I'm gonna check.
Oh, cool. He's gonna check to see if it's open or not.